Okay, welcome to part 3 of the ornithology course for the Ohio Certified Volunteer Naturalists. My name is Matt Schumar, the program coordinator for the Ohio Bird Conservation Initiative at OSU. And in this video, we're going to be talking about habitat associations. So if you recall from our previous videos, we're really trying to instill the idea of narrowing down your set of options for identification. And this isn't simply to get a better handle on identification, but it's also to enrich what you know about your system, the natural environment, and how species vary across these landscapes. So in our previous videos, we talked about geographic location and time of year. And in this video, we're really going to focus on habitat and how that varies and how it changes bird communities. So we can think about habitat associations in a couple ways. One would be to lump birds into a category that we would call generalist species. Now, these are species that don't really have very specific habitat requirements, and we find that they're broadly and widely distributed. We can think about species that would fit under this category, like killdeer, northern cardinal, song sparrow, Carolina wren. These are species that we find pretty much throughout the state and in a variety of different habitats. We find them around our homes and in developed areas, as well as forest and field edges as well. And so, although they may need some structural or tree species requirements, generally we find them in a lot of different environments. And then on the other hand, we could consider some species to be specialists in that they require very specific vegetative species or structure as part of their habitat. In Ohio, we have examples of habitat specialists like upland sandpiper. This is a grassland species that really requires some larger, undisturbed, and in terms of the habitat itself, but also very low disturbance by humans and for grassland habitats. Blue grosbeak. This is a habitat that is a little bit difficult to describe, but you can think of it like fields that with a lot of structure. Habitats that have been left go over time. So we often find blue grosbeaks in agricultural areas, in marginal areas where there are a lot of trees, large trees mixed within field areas. We also find blue grosbeak in some abandoned industrial areas as well. So this kind of mimics that old field habitat. Henslow sparrow is an example of a grassland specialist, and winter wren is a really dark, deep forest habitat specialist. So a lot of the habitat associations we're going to talk about in this segment relate to breeding habitat. I want to point out now, and we'll cover this in a future video, that habitat needs vary over time and throughout the course of a bird's life cycle. A species like cerulean warbler, which is a mature forest breeding species, may be found in forested environments during the breeding season, but during post-breeding, they may actually go into early successional habitats and clear cuts. And so it's really important to understand that habitat needs change over time. But for this particular video, we're going to focus on breeding habitat. It's when a lot of people are getting out, they're observing birds. You may be leading birding trips or outdoor classes during spring and summer. And this is the time when we really get a chance to observe a lot of songbirds, at least. And so for this video, we'll be focusing primarily on breeding habitat. So recall from our previous video, we talked about knowing your landscape understanding the concept of ecoregion and how within any particular region, we have similar types of habitats or a smaller amount of variability across that range of habitats. And so I encourage you to explore a region and really get a better idea of the variability in habitat across those. Within this particular video, we're going to go into some of the more finer scale details about variation within a particular habitat type. So if we think about the Ohio Hills, which is primarily a forested environment, the northern part of that section, like Tuscaroras and Harrison County, has a lot of rolling foothills. There's some reclaimed mines in this area, so forest has actually been removed. And so within this habitat, we have this interspersion of forest and grassland habitat over roaring foothills of Appalachia. As we move south within the region and we get down into Athens, Vinton, Meigs, and even further south, we start to get into some larger, more mature forest, more contiguous forest, lots of hardwoods in this area. And in some of the most southern reaches of the state, we really get into some large-scale forested habitats, less disturbance by humans, forest that's farther away from roads. We may even have some ravines, some really dark, deep forests, hemlock systems in this area as well. That same variability is true of grassland systems. And so, you know, if we think about the Prairie Peninsula and even the Upper Great Lakes Plains, how do open habitats vary throughout this system? We have different agricultural types. We might have different native grasslands as well. So think about how those habitats vary, and do we see different birds in each of those habitats? And we'll talk a little bit about that concept throughout the rest of this video. So habitat associations, we can also, you know, in addition to generalists and specialists, we could focus a little bit more on maybe some of those specialists and talk about broader habitat associations. So we have forest breeding birds. Cerulean warbler, at least for the state of Ohio, is a really great example of a forest, mature forest breeding songbird. Early successional forest. So again, this is also forest, but this is forest that is young and growing. It's very dense. There's no overstory canopy. Historically, this habitat would have been created through natural disturbance like wind throw or ice damage and natural fire. Today, early successional habitat is created through mimicking some of those things, either through prescribed fire in some areas or through timber harvesting and silvicultural practices. And this is really important to consider as we have a lot of early successional species like blue-winged warbler that are actually in steep population decline. And so it's important to understand that successional gradient, one, just to understand how habitats change over time, but also relate that to the bird community and the observations of the species bird species that you're seeing within these communities. So if we take a look at this really great illustration by Julia Rothman on field succession, we can think about, you know, from the very beginning, we have some of those herbaceous plant species, and we might get some grassland birds like bobolink or maybe some of the sparrows. As that gets older and it's left to succession, we start to get woody species being developed in there. Lots of blackberry and black raspberry at first, and then we start to get some saplings. In that shrubby, thick habitat, we would find species like blue-winged warbler, prairie warbler. As it gets a little bit older, field sparrow, white-eyed vireo, up into mature hardwood, cerulean warbler. And over time, we would, as that stand, if it's left to approach old growth conditions, would start to get some disturbance and some variation in the structure over time. We can mimic some of that old growth structure through timber management or manipulating the habitats and creating some canopy gaps and some variation in structure, which is really important for a number of species. So it's important to pay attention to the species that you're observing, whether or not you think it's a field species, a grassland species, and do you see patterns emerging across those habitats? So the same is true for grassland species. Henslow's sparrow is one that we find throughout the state. You know, we have several grassland species: vespers, savanna, grasshopper sparrow. We have bobolink, dick thistle. Think about the birds that you're finding in these open grassland habitats. And marsh birds. We have wetlands throughout the state of Ohio, but especially in the glaciated portion of the state and around the western Lake Erie Basin, lots of important marsh habitat for a variety of species like sora, photographed here. So beyond these very broad categorical habitat associations, once you begin to get an understanding of what bird species might be forest birds or field birds or grassland birds, I encourage you to really observe these bird species to get a better understanding of the variation in the habitat that they're using. Not all forests are the same, and as a result, not all forest breeding bird species are the same as well. We see variation in species occupancy or communities as the variation in that forest changes across structure and species composition. So I have two forest breeding birds here for Ohio that really run the gradient of forest conditions. Kentucky warbler on the left is a species that likes really open canopy forests. They would have done well in Ohio, especially the western part of the state historically, where we had a lot of savanna type forests. And so that transition between open forest habitats and closed forest habitats, where we have trees in the canopy, but a lot of sunlight reaching the floor in a very dense understory. That is where we see Kentucky warblers most often. Winter wren, on the other hand, as a breeding species in Ohio, likes really deep, dark forests, particularly forests that are driven by eastern hemlock and eastern hemlock systems. So very dark, closed canopy forests. It's a relatively rare breeder in the state because we don't have a lot of that habitat throughout Ohio. And so we could find a number of species across that gradient and place them in there. And so I encourage you, when you're looking at forest birds or you're going out and observing the birds within any woodlot or wood patch, take a note at the birds that you're seeing and the conditions of the forest. If it's a more open forest, does that change the species that you're seeing compared to a more closed forest? Because it is important for all of these species. Same is true for early successional. You know, we have a number of species that are very sensitive to forest edges and area sensitivity. Some species less so, like indigo bunting is one that is a little bit less sensitive. We can find them often in field edges or utility rights of ways where there's forest patch nearby. They might be on the edge of some kind of field or open habitat that's very scrubby, and they do well. Other species require larger scale disturbance with smaller or fewer edge effects, large patches of successional shrubby habitat. Prairie warbler is one that is a little bit more area sensitive. We could also think of area sensitive early successional species like blue-winged warbler, yellow-breasted chat, field sparrow, even to some extent, likes larger areas. So edge and area are important. So think about that. You know, when you're seeing species like indigo bunting, do you find them in a variety of habitats, small and large, compared to, say, prairie warbler that you might not find in a utility corridor? Grassland species are really interesting for Ohio and also exhibit a wide range of diversity. We don't have a lot of native grasslands left within the state, at least large scale native grasslands. So some of those species that are a little bit more sensitive to that type of habitat are harder to find in some native prairies. But we also have some artificial habitats that to some extent mimic or can serve as a replacement for some of these species. Reclaimed strip mines, which actually can host some pretty good grass and bird communities because some of these areas are quite large. But also pasture and agriculture can support some grassland species. If we think about some of the grassland breeding sparrows, I have two examples here shown on this slide illustrating the difference in the vegetation and structure. Vesper sparrows will use more of those barren open areas during the breeding season. I often find them in habitats that look just like the photograph here. So agricultural areas early, row crops early in the season, especially soybeans, which looks like we have some kind of bean here in this photograph. Grasshopper sparrows, on the other hand, require some more structure in the grass. So particularly when we have some higher grassland plants, a lot of weedy type plants that are coming up, grasshopper sparrows like to use those as perches to defend territories and sing from. And marshes. In Ohio, we have a lot of marsh birds and some rare and uncommon marsh birds, and there's a lot of variation in marsh systems, and not enough time to go into all the variation here. We have some species that like more open water and are a little bit less sensitive, and we would find a little bit broader distribution like common gallinule. But then kingrail, the species that I mentioned in a previous video, this is a species that's primarily a coastal breeding bird. We really only find it in those larger marshes around the Western Lake Erie Basin and at a few larger inland sites as well. A lot more vegetation compared to, say, what a common gallinule needs. So when you're out at a wetland and you're seeing some of these species, are you finding least bitterns? Where are you seeing least bittern compared to, say, American bittern, some of those things? As I mentioned earlier, it's really important to note that habitat needs vary throughout the course of a year for any given bird. And a lot of what we have been instilled is related to breeding season. But that's only a small part of the picture. So in the next video, we're going to be talking about the full life cycle, how habitat needs vary over time, and how you really should learn to observe birds in the field to help with identification and understanding conservation needs. So stay tuned, we'll cover that next.